So usually we have to be in that fear state of fight or flight or freeze in order to have that heightened awareness of being ready to act without thinking. And so it's a higher energy state because the ego has been disabled temporarily and our senses are heightened. And it seems like that's full attention, and we are called to pay full attention to this moment. Whereas normally we're not fully paying attention to this moment. We're sort of thinking about something else, debating something else. So it's really that attention in the moment that gives us access to that more energy and more able to perceive. And I feel that's part of why I can process things holistically a lot of times, is because I'm really paying attention. I'm not thinking about other stuff. And if I was to take a medication, it would stop that energy. It sort of de-energizes that process. And I wondered before if antipsychotics partially work by making a person gain weight. I gained 50 pounds in 2 months, so gaining weight would make one bigger, heavier, change one's posture to sort of come down lower, as opposed to, say, going into like a higher energy state of psychosis. So it could also be to do with gravity, because they don't really understand how it works anyway. So it's this laziness of perception, this inattention, that causes us to form habits, because we have to make ourselves into sort of these programmed habits so we can be up in our heads thinking about stuff. But if we're actually attentive in the moment, we just see and act. It's sort of like thinking about how if I wake up in the morning, I get up and I have breakfast. I don't say, okay, now I have to go to the bowl and put the cereal in and blah, 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 blah. Maybe some people do that, but my mind doesn't say anything. It's just a knowingness and an acting that that's what I go and do. Whereas most people would probably think, okay, well, now is time. I think I should get up now. Now is time for breakfast. We think that because that's going on, that actually is what makes us get up and go, but it's just sort of like abstracting and commentary. So this commentary in our own voice is what weakens us, because usually we're saying things that will weaken us. And I was thinking about how more information being processed might be felt as fear, because normally that's the reflex. If we're processing more information, we're in fight or flight. That's the usual way. So I'm almost sensing with my job thing that when I look at that document, it's like I sense all the implications, and I'm processing more information, and it gives me a sensation of so-called anxiety. And we don't know how to process more information. And we don't necessarily know where the information is coming from. And I'm wondering if that's why Krishnamurti says we must be free of fear, because we're in this attentive state. It could be interpreted as fear because we're being attentive. And so we must be attentive without fear, instead of attentive because we're in the state of fear, to really be attentive. I thought of a quote: if I'm not living according to my heart, I'm going to need medication for my brain. And I was thinking in terms of the reflex of psychological crisis or distress or psychosis, where a person sort of goes around doing all this different behavior for a certain period of time, and it's almost like gesturing out that, and that's hopefully so people notice, but it's also a release of energy because we're in motion. It's almost like dissipating the heat. And I've experienced a couple of times when I'm coming to the end of the process and I'm in a lot of fear, I'm also freezing cold, and it's almost like all that energy has been dissipated and now I'm freezing. And often I've felt like a homeless person at that point too, because I imagine that they're freezing cold and shaking on the street. And so we exercise to release toxins, but the universe exercises us through this behavioral gestural process to sort of get people to notice that something is happening that's not good. And it's not supposed to just signal that it's not good with the person. the fact that so many people are having this happen means something collectively is going on. So they're finding a lot of bees dead. All of a sudden bees are dead everywhere, and they don't say, well, this bee has this disease and this bee has this disease, oh, and this bee over here has this other disease. It's all dis-ease, and the bees are all dead, and that's happening to us too. It's a collective human thing. The universe is dissipating energy through that process, and it makes sense. We're not moving, we're not behaving as humans are designed to behave. So certain people get funneled into behaving in ways that actually could harm oneself. But really, the person is signaling to the group that something greater is going on. So they're sort of like how I read in the book by Timothy Leary, when he was talking about brain casts and how there's certain roles for humans, just like in a flock of birds. One will be the one that calls when there's danger. So the one that calls when there's danger is risking its own good, because there's a higher chance that the danger is going to get the bird that called. So they talk about just the selfish gene and individuality isn't really true. Well, I think people that go into these crises are signaling to the greater humanity that something is going on. And then people just think that the people that are signaling this are the ones with the problem. But it would be like the flock of birds giving the bird that signaled danger a pill so it would stop tweeting and signaling danger. And then all the birds are sitting ducks. This process is initiated by the universe, by some force or some circumstances. How do we know it won't get to a critical mass where everybody goes into psychosis spontaneously at the same time? And I was thinking about oxytocin and how when there's an oxytocin response, both people get the benefits because both people laugh and both people bond, and then the gesture creates the oxytocin, which is the reward, the laughter, the behavior of laughter. Whereas dopamine a lot of times is about taking power over another person and making them feel weak, and then we feel strong because we made somebody feel weak. And I think laughter would be a measure of health worth measuring. And every day is Judgment Day, as we're judged by our own voice. When we judge, we're actually judging ourselves. We're creating that as our nervous system energy, and it's weakening us. I heard somebody the other day say voting with their feet, meaning not going to something or going to something, which is voting with one's feet. And I thought that was quite cute. And I think it sort of ties into people going to mental health centers as voting with their feet, that's what's going to help them, which is necessary at this time. And then people that end their life are in a way voting with their feet and refusing to move. And I was thinking about how our inner monologue is sort of like streaming, and we're streaming those memes. We're stream-meming. I was talking about how it seems I can only do what the universe wants me to do. And I remember this time, the very first time I went into crisis, I was in that state for about 2 months, and I was driving, and for some reason I was afraid to go through this tunnel to go back to where I lived. And so I ended up driving around, and each time I turned I was like, no, and I was just so afraid, and I was like pretty much driving in circles and all over the place trying to figure out where can I turn, because everywhere that I turned I felt terrified and averted from that and diverted from that path. And I feel like sometimes that's when I get steered into thinking that I need to end my life. It's like I'm rushing towards the means to end my life, and I'm desperately trying to steer off that path of ending my life. And that's why I have the Zap strap with me in case that happens. It just seems like getting programmed towards moving towards that, and it's terrifying. Whereas on the opposite end of the scale, one feels totally free, not limited. I wonder if that's the process of the ego coming back in a way, because it's the one that is limiting us, and so it's like trying to not go toward that. And sometimes I felt like I need to end my life in order to not go back to that. And then usually it's going into the hospital that saves me from that. I wonder if antipsychotics is like a good band-aid in a way, that it mediates the merger back from map consciousness and trans consciousness to ego consciousness, sort of like a buffer. I feel like world centricity and we's and relationship dissipates allostatic load. The allostatic load could be the weakness of the nervous system, which means we need more cortisol to sort of hold us up, more stress. And so when we are in contact with other nervous systems and they're witnessing and perceiving us, some of that energy is dissipated, and the power of their perception, attention, their nervous system, their higher energy gives our nervous system strength to raise our level of consciousness, to be able to move on. I also realize that if I'm wanting to design random acts of kindness and spontaneous social behaviors and positive social contagion into my life, I can just hang around children, because it's a good excuse to be that way. It's a safe way to be that way. It's safe to be childlike around children. I talked about in a different video how I don't think I was sensitive as a child. And then interestingly enough, hours later it popped into my mind how when I was really young, one time I was crossing the road with my sister to go to school, and her lunch kit opened and the apple fell out and rolled down the hill. And I remember being like all freaked out, and I had to run home with her to say to my mom that the apple dropped. And I felt really bad that the apple dropped, because my mom had lovingly put it in there. I remember having that sensation so strong, like my mom put the apple in there, and she did that out of an act of love. And I was probably like 7, pretty young. And so I had that strong sensation, and it was hard for me to shake that. And I remember almost feeling like, how am I going to get through life if I feel this strongly? And I remember at one point feeling desensitized to feel other people's feelings, and I don't know how it happened, but I felt relieved. But I think I was over desensitized to other people's feelings, and that could be part of it, is that it's personally relieving in a way to not be sensitive to others. It can be painful to be sensitive. So a lot of times we try to make ourselves desensitized to that. Maybe one way to do that is to fill ourselves with the thoughts of our own problems, so we're not thinking about others. And then we're always trying to fix all our little problems, and we're not thinking about things on a more global scale. I feel like the ego is a form of sleepwalking, and this transformative consciousness wakes us up, and then we can see patterns beyond our personal ego. And I was thinking how moods can be painful or cause pain, and how I feel like moods could almost be a sign that we're extrapolating more, we're reading more patterns than only our own, because oftentimes a mood is like an over-emotionalization to something. So if it's over-emotionalization, then maybe we're sensing more things, which is making it seem over-emotional, but we're sensing more. So it's not necessarily over-emotion, we're just sensing more. But those that would judge the over-emotionalism cannot sense that which the one is sensing. And moods could be a different barometer that are challenging us to disrupt the social fabric. And we don't use it in this way properly. We don't see it as this is more information that we're processing than just the ego self. We've all been trained to be ego self processors, so everything that one is experiencing is always assumed to be the ego self and the person's fault. So to only adjust back to consensus and manage is missing the point, because we're sensing more, so there's more responsibility to act on things. When your compass is in a dopamine ego voice, then you have a mood disorder. We make everything about the ego. It's sort of the ego that is pathologized. It's like, well, you're not well, your ego's not well. But what is well is sensing so many other things. It's a completely rich thing. When the ego breaks, or it might not even break as much as just more information is coming in from other dimensions, and we're processing that. So when we're processing all of that, we're being perceived as behaving as a different ego, as dysfunctional or non-functional or different or not consistent, when really we're processing information differently. What we are is so much greater than an ego, and when we get in touch with that, we're seen as non-functional and dysfunctional and disordered and pathologized. We've been tricked into thinking that we are an ego, so we've been processing that way for so long, we forget how to process naturally as human beings. And then when we reconnect with that, because the ego's a false structure, it can't go on forever. It could go on forever till death do you part. It's a different compass through which to move your center of gravity around. We have these body, mind, feelings, egos, spirits, and it's a matter of what we want to tune into. We can tune into the ego game, or we can tune into a different game and create a new game.